All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today's webinar is on the place of ecological silviculture now and in the future. This is presented by Dr. Brian Palik, who is the senior scientist at the USDA Forest Service Station at the Northern Research Station. And we'll be introducing Brian a little bit more later on, but we want to go over a few pre-webinar items first. So I would like to start this week's course by sharing NCTC's land acknowledgement with you all. The National Conservation Training Center is located on the ancestral lands of many Indigenous people. Those include, but are not limited to, the Massawomac, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. And NCTC is dedicated to building the relationships with Indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn more about the land that they reside in. And so if you have any questions about that or want to know more of who lived on the land that you live and work at, let me know and I can send you a link in the chat. I also wanted to mention that NCTC, we welcome all students. It is my intention to create a safe and inclusive and productive learning environment where everyone feels welcome. We understand that by having diverse people, we can have diverse ideas as well. And so if you have any problems in the webinar, let me know. We do have ASL interpreters on throughout the entire webinar, and we do have closed captioning as well. Just a quick disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the material and images may be protected by copyright and may be licensed us by third parties and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not imply federal endorsement. Lastly, you guys are all muted, but feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Make sure when you put stuff into the chat, you send it out to everyone, not just the panelists, and we'd love to know where you're coming in from. Last but not least, the best way to view our webinar is using side-by-side gallery, and then you can not only see the presenter, but also our interpreters as well. So make sure that you have that setting checked. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Maria.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Genoviak. I work for the Forest Service, where I direct the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I'm really happy to be here today on behalf of our partnership team who has arranged this ecological forestry in the context of climate change webinar series. We worked with many partners, and it's been a real team effort led by our partners with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Ecology Working Group, the Science Application and Migratory Birds Program, and the National Conservation Training Center, along with our teams at the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And so we're just really happy to be able to be here today, have so many people attending this webinar, and really happy just to be able to see this series come in. This is our last one. So next slide. This is the last of this particular series that's focused on ecological forestry. This has been a 12-part series that's been talking about how forest disturbances, things like fire, wind, ice storms, flooding, these different things are affecting forest ecosystems, and thinking about how ecological forestry and climate adaptation approaches can help inform forest and wildlife habitat management. It's been really wonderful. I pasted the link here in the chat to the whole series. And so we're really happy. We will have this one, as you know, is being recorded. We should have it up within a few days for you to be able to view it. I will introduce our presenter momentarily, but I wanted to give a chance for Jeff Horan, one of my co-hosts and co-organizers, to talk about the next series that we are starting to plan.
Thanks, Maria. So again, and thanks to each of you, the participants. As Maria said, this is the last in our series. So we started this series back in September of 2023, and we've now run 5 of these series. And each of you, again, if it wasn't for the participants, we wouldn't have the series. But each of you are one of 3,200 folks that are registered for this series. And again, since this is the last piece of this series, and again, we're really thrilled to have Brian Palik anchor this. And Brian was very helpful in putting the series together, as was Maria. And it's been great to have NCTC with Gwyneth Daunton and Jim Siegel really handle the technical and behind the scenes stuff. So, but again, we wouldn't have the series without you guys. And we hope to have another series that follows this up. We still have a lot of work to do to put it together. But what we're looking at is a series called Managing Forest Habitat in the Changing World. And this is planned to be a panel discussion series. So we are thinking we might need a little more time. So we might interrupt your day with an extra 30 minutes. So we probably would have this, around lunchtime or something, so you could spend some time. But we really think we might need 90 minutes. And what we hope to have is interactive panel discussions that connect land managers, researchers, and practitioners across geographies and across ownerships. And the topics we want to talk about is managing forest habitat in the context of climate, social, economic, and ecological changes. So again, it'll be some of the same partners. We'll have some new folks putting this together, but it's a lot of the same folks. And we hope that the series will still be meaningful for folks here. So with that, I'll turn it back to Maria. And again, thanks, Maria, to NIAX and to the Climate Hub for helping host this series. And thanks to everyone who has been loyal viewers throughout. So way to go, you all. All right, Maria, take it away.
Yeah, so for today, I think this is great. I think it is like a closing plenary in terms of being able to have this topic. So today we have Brian Palik with us, who's going to talk about the place of ecological silviculture now and in the future. And so I think many of you, I see many familiar faces in the thread. I think many of you know Brian, but if you don't, Dr. Brian Palik is a senior scientist of applied forest ecology who works for the USDA Forest Service Research and Development in the Northern Research Station. It's based in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And this is really perfect because Brian has the highest level of being a scientist that the agency has, which is really great. He's been working in this arena for a really long time. And his research has 2 central themes that are really the core of this particular series: adapting forests to an uncertain climate future, and also ecological silviculture based on natural models. And so Brian's been one of the people helping to organize this particular series and advise us on different presenters. And so today he'll be kind of tying a bow around this with his thoughts related to this particular topic. And so with that, Brian, I'm going to let you put up your slides. And the other thing that we do is I'll just let people know during Brian's presentation, we're actually going to stop about midway and let people have a pause for questions. I'm saying this out loud to remind myself as moderator, Brian as presenter, and then encourage all of you to put questions in the chat as we go along, and I will try and pull one of those for a question break about 10 or probably about 15 minutes in. So.
Okay,
Brian.
Thanks, Maria.
Yeah, there you go.
My slides up, you can hear me?
Yep, we're all good.
Okay, good. So I've been at this so long that I look a lot older than that photo that Maria just put up. But anyhow, I'm happy to be here. And as Maria said, I'm bringing this series back around full circle to somewhat to the beginning. If you're here from the start, you know that Tony D'Amato opened the series off and he talked about ecological silviculture. I'm going to revisit just briefly some of the stuff that he covered just to remind you. But then what I want to move on to is have us think about is ecological silviculture, which sometimes is accused of looking too much to the past. Is it relevant given the kind of changes and uncertainty we have going on in the world now? So those are my general topics. I'm doing the talking, but along with Tony, Jerry Franklin, and Norm Johnson, are really instrumental to many of the ideas that I'm going to present. And then a lot of what I'm going to talk about are captured in these references that I'm showing here, and then some others that I'll point out to you as well. Okay, so to start, the why, what, and where of ecological silviculture on the landscape. So here's the definition that comes out of this book that Tony and I and Jerry and Norm put together. It's the toolbox to manage forest stands as ecosystems based on emulation of natural models, and that explicitly incorporates ecological principles. And we'll talk about those principles in just a bit. You can see the objectives for ecological silviculture are quite broad, and undoubtedly include things that many of you that are on this and listening are interested in. But importantly, it doesn't exclude timber production or fiber production or wood productivity. It's important that you understand that's part of the mix as well. So why would we, that's in a nutshell, that's what ecological silviculture is. Why would we even be thinking about it? Well, some of you know who this guy is here. Leopold said to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. He was talking about species composition specifically, but we have paraphrased this to talk about keeping all the cogs and wheels in terms of composition and structure as the precaution for intelligent silviculture. And that's what ecological silviculture does. Jerry has said this over decades. If your goal is to sustain ecological services provided by natural forest ecosystems, then management based on natural processes, disturbance development is the appropriate model. Again, that's what ecological silviculture does. And then probably the person I consider to be sort of the guru of academic silviculture in the US, Klaus Putman, many of you know him at Oregon State, has talked about what we really need is a comprehensive rethinking of silviculture, not just a tweaking of traditional silviculture, which Klaus has said and others have as well, is based on agricultural ecosystems as much as natural ecosystems. So again, that's what ecological silviculture does. And then the last thing I'll point out, getting back to this idea, sustaining economic output through management is critical for providing incentives, financial incentives to use ecological approaches. You can find this codified in Forest Stewardship Council language and other places. So we have to be able to pay for what we do. Again, that's what ecological silviculture does. So a little bit more on why you would be thinking about this. Thinking about the changing drivers of forest management. So things like this, the rise of non-traditional forest owners and stewards, the Nature Conservancy, various tribes across the country, and others have different goals and objectives than timber-focused stakeholders will. The objectives of traditional forest stewards, like the National Forest System, have evolved over time to be more inclusive of sustaining a broad array of ecosystem services, and it's codified into law with the 2012 planning rule. And then there's third-party certification, like FSC and others that include criteria and indicators reflective of natural models, and you can see that written into some of these indicators. So again, ecological silviculture is designed to respond to those drivers, changing drivers and needs. So let's get back to what it is in a little more detail. The definition included this, that incorporates foundational principles. And we talk about these four: continuity, complexity, timing, and context. So I'll just review this again briefly. If you were here from the beginning, Tony went over this as well. Continuity is continuity of forest structure, function, and biota between a pre and a post-disturbance ecosystem relative to a regeneration scale event, whatever that happens to be. We'll look at scale in a minute. And this is really comes out of the idea of biological legacies and ecological memory. So it's natural disturbance with legacies left behind in terms of live trees, dead wood, propagules, etc. And how do we implement that in a managed system? Well, one of the ways that has gotten a lot of interest and activity in the last 20 years is variable retention harvesting, where you're leaving things behind intentionally in different ways. I have mentioned this already, but I want to point this out. When I say a timber-focused model, I'll come back to this a few times. This is silviculture that has timber as the driving objective. Sometimes that's by design, like in a plantation, but it's often comes about inadvertently because of this reliance on a traditional agricultural ecosystem-based model for our silviculture that we have that came to us from Europe and has been part of our U.S. silviculture. So I'll come back to that term. So anyhow, getting back to continuity, this is what I mean by scale. So structure and legacies that occur at all scales of regeneration disturbance. The top one is what we normally think of, stand replacing canopy disturbances like a fire out west that leaves live trees and dead wood behind. But it's also something we should be thinking about with what I'm calling a heavy partial canopy disturbance. We'll look at an example of this in a little bit here, but something that isn't quite stand replacing. But it's also true of stand maintaining, gap-based disturbances. So certainly the matrix of the forest that gaps occur in lends complexity, but I'm talking about what's going on within that disturbed area in terms of residual trees and dead wood and soil patterns and biota and so on. Okay, so that was continuity. Second principle is complexity diversity. And this is the development of structural complexity, spatial heterogeneity, and species diversity in developing stands that are already established, or patches. It isn't always at a stand scale, but a patch scale. So that kind of stuff results from growth of trees, from decadence, from mortality, from small scale disturbance, from succession. And there's different ways you can implement it in a managed setting, but variable density thinning is one example. We'll look at an example of that in a bit. Deliberate decadence creation, enrichment planning are all things that lend to addressing that principle. And so just some pictures of what I mean here with complexity diversity. It's big trees. And what we know is that big trees aren't just bigger examples of small trees. They're morphologically and functionally different because of their branch systems, because of buttressed roots, etc. We also know, and this is all relative to the ecosystem, that natural ecosystems tend to have more than one tree species. We don't often manage them for more than one or just a couple in some cases. But naturally, they will have more than one. And we don't typically manage that way. And then there's things like vertical and horizontal canopy heterogeneity and structure. Declining trees, really important ecologically. And dead wood, of course, leading to resource and microclimate variation and specialized habitat. Okay, the third principle is timing. This refers to the importance of appropriate timescales for specific structural and functional attributes to develop, like those associated with the population of large old trees. And there's different ways that you can implement this in a managed setting, but one is allowing ecologically appropriate time intervals between silvicultural interventions, especially regeneration harvest interventions. So, in that cartoon on the left, it's just showing that a harvest doesn't occur until that kind of complexity develops. This is related to rotation age in even age stands and cutting cycles in multi-cohort stands, but it's not based on just growth, like culmination of mean annual increment, if you know that term. It's based on how long it takes to develop complex structure and composition. And part of this principle is allowing some trees to live out their life cycles. So I like to say there's no such thing as an ecologically overmature tree. Okay, the fourth principle goes upscale. It's not a stand scale thing, but I'll mention it. It's landscape context and thinking about how stand scale actions in a landscape interact. And these would be things like edge patch structure and cumulative effects. So just a couple of examples. On the top there, we know that small patches have more edge relative to their area than larger patches. So that's the whole edge area ratio thing. And what that means in terms of a landscape is a bunch of smaller patches of that size, like on the left, have more edge in that landscape than one single patch of the same area. So it translates into real world things like in the context of watersheds and subwatersheds, where many small patches have greater influence on the stream network, in this case, potentially a negative influence, but a change than one large patch of the same area. Another way that landscape context comes into play is thinking about contrast between patches and their edges. You're going to have really sharp, simple edges. You can have high contrast. You can have low contrast. And this brings it back to that principle of continuity, whereas retention of trees in a harvest unit, one thing they do is they soften that transition from the harvest area to the unharvested area, like in that photo. Okay. So those are the principles. And what do we do with them? Well, what we do with them is incorporate them into what we call ecological silvicultural systems. The long-term sequence of treatments for restoring, so oftentimes we're talking about restoration or sustaining composition and complex structure of forests, informed by natural disturbance and development, incorporates those foundational principles, and importantly, a goal of reducing the disparity between healthy natural ecosystems and their managed counterparts. So we name these systems after the natural disturbance regime, and we've called them disturbance archetypes. So there's 4 we have worked on and written a bit about: infrequent severe, frequent low severity, periodic gap-based, and mixed severity. There are more. I'm sure many of you can come up with things that these don't fit to, but they do. These actually encompass a lot of our forests globally. And then this specific silvicultural system reflects the archetype and the forest type, like gap-based disturbance in northern hardwoods, as an example. Now, you might ask, and I am asked this, isn't classical silviculture based on understanding natural ecosystem dynamics? Remembering that the classical silviculture we learned, or I learned in school anyhow, really is a timber-focused model by design or otherwise. And the answer to that is yes, but not really. So typically, and you won't find this in the textbooks, classic textbooks in silviculture, a goal of reducing that disparity between a healthy natural ecosystem and the managed, based as much on ecological or ecology of agricultural ecosystems as natural, and then no explicit goal of incorporating those principles as we've outlined them. Okay, so this may be a little early, Maria, but my prompt is if there's questions to this point, and we can do this again if need to, but I'm going to shift gears a bit. So if you want.
Yeah, I'll just see if anyone has a question. Remind them to post them in the chat. We can hit them now or later as we go. I think, Brian, I really like you covering this and laying things out. I think it's a really good kind of decoder ring for people, especially. I think it's more accessible in terms of language for silviculture for non-silviculturists. I'm curious, of the 4 principles that you have laid out, do you feel like there is one that tends to be maybe lagging behind in terms of people's consideration, or is it more based on sort of the setting of the organization or the individual that tends to maybe be sort of, if you're approaching these as a checklist, is there one that you would emphasize as maybe not getting as much attention?
Yeah, I think so. Really good question. So continuity, the idea of biological legacies and burial retention has been around a while now, 20 years, something like that. So that's something that's caught on, and you will find most organizations address it in some way. The working on established stands to enhance their complexity or restore it, oftentimes getting some attention as well. I would say the thing that is lacking is the timing principle, particularly getting people to think about the need to let trees and stands, patches, stands develop into more complex structures and add their species that they should have later in succession, and leaving trees to die naturally. So I would say it's timing is the one that maybe we need some more work on.
Awesome. And I'll have one more question because I know there are a few that have come in, and I'll loop back to some of these after your presentation, since I know you'll have some examples. But one that came in that I liked, and you kind of touched on this, is the person says, I've heard the term decadence used negatively in terms of forest structure. How can we describe the importance of actively cultivating it? And you've already touched on this a bit, but I wanted to see if you had anything more you wanted to add.
Yeah, well, many of you are probably wildlife biologists. You understand the importance of dead wood, not just dead trees and dead wood, snags, logs on the ground, but declining trees and that are developing decadence, so that they're forming cavities and they have dead branches and so on. You know how important that is to habitat. And it's just not something that has been actively accepted in traditional forest management and classical silviculture. Dead trees, declining trees had been viewed as something bad that we remove to improve the growing stock that we have left behind. So it's a mind shift that's needed. And a lot of organizations do this now. They maintain dead wood, but the declining trees maybe is still a hurdle to get over. So things that are on their way out but aren't dead yet and leaving them behind. I think I'd get back in our example. The example I use in red pine, we touch on this a little bit, so you'll see.
Great. All right, this was good. We got questions rolling in, so I'm going to let you keep going, Brian. People can keep putting their questions in the chat. I'm collecting them, and we'll have time at the end to work through many of them. So
okay, so up till this point, it's kind of been a review. If you were here from the beginning with Tony D'Amato, he would have covered most of that. So what I want to do now is give you an example of how we do this in a real world setting. So an ecological silvicultural system example. I'm going to use I'm calling it the Laurentian Acadian Northern Pine Woodland red pine forests in the Lake States. So if you speak land fire, that's what it's called there. This is an example of an archetype 4 forest, characterized by disturbances of varying severity, ranging from infrequent near stand replacing to heavy but less than stand replacing. I was taught, many of you maybe were, that red pine ecosystems in the Lake States were based on stand replacing disturbances and developed into even age stands. It's not to say that doesn't happen, but it rarely happens. So they're more of this archetype 4 example. And I'm talking about, I think it's green in this map here in the Northern Lake States. So some characteristics of that ecosystem: sustained dominance by shade intolerant red pine for centuries, forever, if the natural disturbance regime is functioning right. But inclusion of other tree species. So 10, 11, 12 tree species total occurred in these ecosystems. We don't manage for that, but for timber anyhow. Extended pre-forest, young forest, mature forest. We'll look at those in a minute here. Long life species, again, red pine, eastern white pine. Complex age structures. So not just even age and not narrowly even age, probably ever. Structurally complex and heterogeneous, spatially heterogeneous. And the disturbances regime is frequent fire, as you can imagine, but way more frequent than I ever imagined. So our work with Mike Stambaugh from the University of Missouri in our part of the world found a 6.6 year mean fire return interval in the areas we work in. And that ranges from low severity to higher severity. And it's not just us. People in northern Wisconsin and northern Michigan have found similar numbers. So I mentioned pre-forest. If you're not familiar with this is that stage of development where trees don't dominate the site. It's really herbaceous and shrubby vegetation, and we tend not to manage for pre-forest at all. You might call it early successional habitat in a forest, but the point is it's before trees take over and dominate the site. And it's likely to be important in fire-dependent forests like this. Okay, so I mentioned the natural disturbance regime, frequent fire, but not stand replacing. And so as such, there's overstory present during regeneration events, leading to complex age structures, 2-cohort, multi-cohort. If you can, some that we've uncovered in age are single cohort, but broadly 60 to 70 year establishment windows for pine. And the funny thing is, researchers from the olden days of yore, people will be saying that about me, I guess, but anyhow, these folks knew this and they wrote about it. And they oftentimes included these great photographs that illustrated literally group gap-based regeneration in pine systems, red pine systems. Okay, so now that's how they looked and worked naturally. Let's contrast to what we have on the landscape in the Lake States. Even age regeneration systems, spatially homogeneous structure, managing for high density, favoring the A-line, if you know stocking charts. Generally short rotations, 60 to 90 years, some organizations like national forests and lake states, I'm sure, go longer than this, but timber focused programs don't like to, even 90 is old. Strongly red pine dominated. Again, 10, 11, 12 species of trees should be there. And early full stocking and regeneration, not the 60 to 70 year establishment windows that I was talking about. And in the lake states, most of this plantation. Red pine resource, according to FIA, 76% are plantations. And I would say that there's nothing wrong with that model, unless your objectives include something more than timber as the priority. And it is important, that model and this approach, because economically, it's a really important forest type species in terms of how much is harvested and what it's used for. And this is just a generalized prescription for red pine focused management. You can see how it lays out there. And certainly that's what's used in plantations, but it's also used in natural origin red pine that's managed for those products there that I'm showing in yellow. Okay, so let's contrast that to what we call an ecological silvicultural system for Great Lakes mixed pine ecosystem. And you can see this is laid out by developmental stage or event, disturbance and legacy creation, pre-forest, young, mature, old forest. And you can see their duration, which is, variable. Sometimes it's hard to pick out. We're going to delve into each one of these a little bit more. And then you can see examples of the silviculture you might include in there. An important point of this, before I go on to the details of this, is thinking about where the principles come into play. And it's like this. Continuity is what you get at a regeneration harvest when you're leaving structures behind and species behind. Complexity and diversity develop over time in young and mature forest stands. And then timing is important, one, to let that forest develop to a point where it is complex, or even move it on into the old forest condition. So you see how they play in. If you're interested in these approaches, I'm not trying to sell this book. We get no royalties from this. It all is donated to the Forest Stewardship Guild. But there are examples from across the US and several in Canada and several internationally of different people that have developed their take on ecological silvicultural systems for their forest. So you could look at that. Okay, a little detail. This stage, disturbance and legacy creation. This is, again, the action would be variable retention or harvesting, deliberate decadence creation or deadwood creation with the goal of continuity of structure. Here's what it looks like on the ground. The left is cartoon format. So variable means just that, from large gaps to an irregular shelter wood, a lot of different patterns that you could use in terms of that retention. And these are real examples from the Chippewa National Forest where they use these approaches, and every one of them looks a little bit different. Okay, so here's young forest. Notice the age range, 30 to 70 years. If you're interested in growing saw timber for 2x4s or red pine, you're not going to want things to last much longer than 70 years, but we consider that to be young developmentally. This is where you might use variable density thinning, which is an approach to accelerate the development of spatial heterogeneity, particularly in plantations or simplified forests. And it shortens the time required to reach a more complex stage. This all came out of plantations of Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest. And again, we've been looking at it with red pine and mostly in Minnesota here as well. Which is an example of what it does. This is from these plantations shown in that photo. So the left graph shows basal area after thinning. Standard thinning, which is row thinning, and then variable density, VDT. The residual basal area is the same, but look at the difference in photosynthetically active radiation between the two settings. VDT leads to different environments in terms of resources, in terms of habitat, even though the basal area is the same. So just an example. Mature forest, we consider mature to be in that kind of age range up to 150. And here's where you might be doing, again, variable density thinning or crop tree release, or something that puts gaps and establishes new species or new regeneration into it. And the graph here just shows something we've worked on quite a bit, Tony D'Amato and I, that you can influence the growth of those old trees with thinning, even in that old stage. So this just shows periodic and mean annual increment across time. These trees were 85 years old when this study was put in, and they're like 178 now. This is truncated there. And the point of this is that thin red pine stands reach peak mean annual increment, the dashed line down here, at ages well beyond what most people think about in terms of when they're interested in growth and yield. Stand level productivity is responsive to thinning. The T's are thinning. These have been thinned 7 times. And these little upturns in growth reflect that. And then mean annual increment remains constant across here. Doesn't peak and then drop radically, justifying the use of thinking about something other than MAI as the rotation trigger. Okay, so old forests then. We don't consider these ecosystems to be old in terms of their structure and composition until after 150 years old. And what might you do there? Well, you might do nothing, or you might do some things to restore structure and composition, to enhance complexity and heterogeneity. So it would be more restoration to an old forest stand. And why is that important? Goes to this 4th principle. There's little old and really little complex mature woodland in the lake states. Again, 76% of the resources in a plantation. Okay, so what I want to do here is just a little bit thinking about where you would be doing this. And our answer to that is almost everywhere outside of intensely managed plantations. And here's what I mean. So think about the global forest. It's like 4 billion hectares of forest. One end of that is intensive production, mostly plantations, like 0.3 billion hectares. And the other end are formally protected reserves, like 0.65 billion hectares. Then there's everything in between, which is over 3 billion hectares. And that's where we talk about being the place for ecological silviculture in some way. So you can look at it in cartoon form. Embedded intensive production reserves in this matrix, the places in between shown, I think that's green, shows up as green. And who, well, let me back up here before I say who. If you're a student of this landscape allocation models, you recognize this as being kind of a form of the triad model. And if you want to learn more about that, Austin Hims did this really nice review recently of the triad. So who would be working in the matrix? Who's interested in ecological forestry? Well, family forest owners are largest private land or largest group of landowners in the eastern US, interested in more than just timber. Conservation stewards like the TNC, again, different objectives. Tribal forests, they may be harvesting trees for revenue, but they almost always have other objectives. Federal forests, like the national forests, that have to do this by law. Wildlife refuges that are interested in sustainable ecosystems. State trust forests, a little tricky in that the trust generally, there's a requirement to optimize or maximize revenue on trust forest land, but most of these will be certified and follow best management guidelines. So there's ecology or ecological perspectives involved with that. And there are certified industrial forests in different parts of the US, which are doing a really good job that way. Still, having said this, not everyone will apply the principles the same way. That is, the matrix won't all be the same shade of green. Jerry Franklin has talked about this in his shades of green model for landscapes. And here's just a different way of thinking about this. This is a real example of northern hardwood silviculture in the northern lake states. So intensive production, the deep yellow, a plantation of red pine on a northern hardwood site. Used to be done a lot. I don't know that it still is. Pretty yellow, so not ecological. A little more green, but still pretty yellow. This is a biomass harvest in northern Minnesota where there's some attention being given to legacies. It's a little greener. Then you can get to this, say managing for an even age stand of sugar maple on a northern hardwood site, more ecological. Shouldn't be even age, shouldn't be just silviculture if it's a natural system, but it's closer. Or you could be doing extended rotation sugar maple with legacies like this woodpecker tree being left on site, even greener. And then you get to this, something like a multi-cohort mixed species stand with old residuals. That's about as green as you can get. in terms of reducing that disparity with the old forest stage ecosystem, which is that mixed species, complex age structure stands that we have in a few places in the lake states. So the idea is that we're getting greener, more like the natural model. Here's where I want to shift to the last part of this, is thinking about the future. That natural model is sometimes suggested that we are looking too much to the past for that. So does ecological silviculture look too much to the past, to conditions that are no longer relevant, like that kind of northern hardwood model in the lake states? And it has to do with these evolving drivers of forest management, which are interrelated: invasive species, catastrophic wildfires, and then climate change. And our answer to that is ecological silviculture is designed to respond to those drivers. It can be adaptation silviculture. So think about it like this timber-focused model, what does it do? Deliberately or otherwise, reduces tree species richness, simplifies age and size structures, maintains high stocking. All those things limit options in the face of uncertainty. Then an ecological model does the opposite of that: sustains, restores tree species, allows, or actually treats for the development of complex structures with ecosystem appropriate stocking and timing. All those things enhance the capacity, adaptive capacity and options. And then the four principles do the same thing. You can look at this at your leisure, where each one of them lends to greater options in the face of uncertainty. So I'll give you an example of how this fits in, thinking about ecological silviculture specifically within a climate adaptation framework. And the framework that I work on with colleagues, Maria and other people, Tony, a bunch of people, is the resistance resilience transition framework. And Linda Nagel wrote about this in the Journal of Forestry a few years ago. And it's what we use in the ASK network, Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network. And kind of in a nutshell, it looks like this. ASK is looking at gradients of impact and gradient of change. So resistance would be this: managing to enhance resistance to a stress like drought. And how would you do that? Well, thinning to a lower stocking does that. I'll show you an example in a minute. Resilience, restoring complex structure, but within the range of natural variability for an ecosystem, because we know that some species are more adaptable and some structures are more stable to disturbance. And then there's transition, which is, the most radical adaptation approach, where you probably are going to be introducing genotypes and species, including novel species, that are better adapted. But we like to talk about doing that within the context of those four foundational principles. So I'll just briefly show you an example of how we're doing this in our Red Pine Ask installation. This is the Ask network. We're circled there, Red Pine Ask. We were the first one on the ground. We hit 10 years this summer. And then you can see the rest of them. So Red Pine Ask is within the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe homeland, first and foremost, which is on top of the Chippewa National Forest, literally, if you didn't know that. And then within that is the Cutfoot Experimental Forest, where this experimental array is located. So the starting condition is this: overly red pine dominated. These are natural origin post-1918 fire, but almost exclusively red pine. Long fire excluded, 100 years. High stocking in terms of basal area, overstocked, with a dense shrub layer. And all these things make this forest climate change vulnerable. So it doesn't look like this lower picture here. It looks more like the upper one. So here's what we do with resistance. We thin to a woodland density. That's all that is. You're seeing that post-thinning. Foresters know how to do that. It enhances drought resistance, and we know this from research, really nice research, not just for red pine, but ponderosa pine does the same thing. But we also manage this on extended rotation. These trees, again, are over 100 years old. And there's this particular example of resistance. We have no targeted regeneration activities. It's just whatever happens there. Then there's resilience, where we're harvesting to a woodland density, but also a spatial structure, variable structure through variable density thinning. You don't see it, but there's retention of live trees in the gaps. Initially, a 2-cohort age structure is the goal, and we're planting native species, but native species in some cases with more southern seed sources. And then there's transition. We use an irregular shelter wood, expanding gap approach with indefinite retention of some trees, with the goal of multi-cohort structure, those complex age structures that people have found in this system naturally. We're planting adapted native species like resilience, but also some novel species, including bitternut hickory and true white oak, Quercus alba. So here's how it's both ecological and adaptive. Resistance, thinning to a woodland structure, lower stocking, that's ecological. That's what those ecosystems look like, but it's adaptive because we're enhancing drought resistance for growth. Resilience, we're maintaining diverse native tree species, complex age structures. Both of those are ecological. That's how the system worked naturally. We know it's adaptive. Transition, we're moving seed sources, sometimes species that should be present already. And I would argue that's ecological. Our landscape change is such that big seeded species like oaks and hickories don't move well on their own. So by helping them along, we're introducing those species that probably should be there already. And we know they're adaptive because those species tend to be have favorable projections for habitat suitability. And we're also incorporating the foundational principles in transition as well. So what I do is kind of finish up with these ideas. Ecological silviculture. Sometimes we are accused of it being the same stuff, but new terms. So the question is, isn't classical silviculture based on understanding natural ecosystems? And the answer is yes, but not really. And here's why. Ecological silviculture is responsive to changing global forces. By emphasizing diversity and complexity, it's more responsive to evolving needs of stewards and stakeholders than timber-focused silviculture. Ecological silviculture is based on natural models. An explicit goal is to reduce that disparity between a managed and a healthy natural ecosystem. Classic silviculture may conceptually share that goal, but in reality, it tends to perpetuate it. Ecological silviculture is grounded in ecological principles, the four that we talked about. Classical silviculture is based as much on ecology of agriculture ecosystems as natural models. I'm not the only one saying that. Again, I trust when Klaus Putman says this, I tend to listen, so you can look into his work. Ecological silviculture is ecosystem centric. Classical silviculture, the responsive timber species is the framework upon which other ecosystem components are addressed. I've called this tail wagging the dog silviculture, and it really should be the other way around if you're truly ecological. And then finally, as I was just finishing up here, ecological silviculture is adaptation silviculture, or can be. So I've been talking, but I just want to point out that Tony, Jerry, and Norm were really instrumental in all the ecological silviculture ideas that I have laid out here. So Maria, with that, I believe I'm done.
Great, thanks so much. That was wonderful. We have about a half a dozen questions, so I think we can stroll through those, and potentially in the time we have, we might be able to pick up a few more. So if folks have those, we'll continue to go to the hour, and so put those in. So two questions related to soils that came in kind of around the time we took a break. One is, can you talk about weaving in the role of soil preservation and restoration and in terms of long-term ecosystem health as it relates to some of the ideas that you had? And then I guess a second question came in kind of, I think, related, so I'll just toss it in as well. Well, no, it wasn't focused on soils.
Okay, well,
so soil preservation.
Yeah, I'll do that first, in that I'm not sure I'm the best person to address that, or I fully understand the question. But one of the things that Jerry Franklin has talked about in terms of biological legacies is the importance of soil pattern and how it develops over time, and what it looks like in old ecosystems where large root systems have decomposed and there's patches of organic matter within the soil that's spatially variable. And so, again, I'm probably not fully understanding the question, but there is thoughts about, and people have talked about, the role of soil pattern within stands as a type of legacy that we ought to be thinking about and not deliberately trying to, simplify.
Yeah, I think another one that comes to mind, and you can add on or not, but is some of the thoughts about like continuous cover forestry in terms of if you have trees or vegetation, you also have roots, and that's going to be helping with the soil and
Yeah.
that continuity
Yep.
piece.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That legacy trees are continue to contribute to the soil in that way. So good.
There was another question that was kind of building on this one about regenerative forestry, and regenerative forestry as being a emerging category or term that often focuses on soils. And so I'm curious, are you encountering regenerative forestry as a term? How does it fit with ecological forestry?
Well, so we have written about a bit how some of these different approaches are similar or different, like continuous cover forestry from Europe. Regenerative has come out since like that first book that I put up where we have a chapter on, these different approaches and what they mean. So we have discussed it as a group, Tony D'Amato and I applaud people thinking about a different approach to forestry than what I call timber focus or classical. Whether it's, I think there's enough overlap that we're on common ground, is what I would say.
Great. Shifting topics a bit, there was a question about whether there is research into landscape connectivity and how ecological silviculture can enhance habitat for various wildlife species, as well as allowing for timber.
Well, there's tons of research over the last many decades on landscape connectivity and issues related to landscape structure. I'm not a landscape person, but we have a chapter in that first book on landscapes and how they're influenced by stand scale activity. And again, I pointed out with, really quickly with one picture, the whole idea of continuity of legacies in harvest units are meant to soften that landscape and provide greater opportunity for connectivity across the landscape from patch to patch. And, you'd have, whoever asked that question would have to look into that kind of research in different parts of the world where they're interested in.
Great. There was a question about the ecological silviculture framework and principles that you presented, and someone was asking if you would or have taught an introductory silviculture class using those archetypes. Have you, if you have that you found them to be more useful in teaching new foresters?
Yeah, so I'm an ecologist, forest ecologist by training, and I get away with not having to pay attention to teaching sort of classical silviculture. That's Tony D'Amato's job. He was brought into this work specifically because he spans those groups and is respected by ecologists and traditional foresters. So I find it very useful as teaching tools. And in fact, in 2 weeks, I teach a week-long course on this to Fish and Wildlife. And in Maine, we're going to be this year on ecological forestry and silviculture. So I do that. And again, I preface when I do that is I'm not a classically trained silviculturist or forester. I'm an ecologist who comes at it from a different direction. And it works well for me, I guess is the point.
Great. Staying on this theme, there's a question that came in recently about, do classical silvicultural models, things like BDQ, have any use in the ecological silviculture paradigm? So you're talking about kind of starting with ecological forestry, but then bringing in maybe some of those classical silviculture ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, we've written about this in different ways, and BDQ is one of the things that we have a whole kind of box discourse thing in our first book, and what it is and why it can fall short in terms of meeting ecological objectives. When you, for example, put an upper limit on a tree diameter, which that approach does. And our argument is why ecologically it makes no sense to do that. Anyhow, the point is there are some, and Tony has done this, and I can't remember exactly which reference it's in, but he does a crosswalk between those terms traditional silviculture and ecological silviculture. And expanding gap regular shelterwood is a great one. It's really a way of thinking about retention harvesting, variable retention harvesting, and how it's important ecologically, but then also can relate to what people do with irregular shelterwoods. So it's very valid to be thinking about that. What kind of classical silviculture approaches and terms do in terms of linking up to ecological silviculture.
Great. All right, questions are coming in fast and furious. I'm going to try to get some that are maybe bringing in some of the climate and other aspects. Let's see. One is, are there examples of where ecological silviculture is being applied at the landscape scale that you can think of, and places where the outcomes have perhaps been documented?
Well, again, I'm not a landscape ecologist. I don't work in that realm. I don't think about it all that much. But I guess the example that comes to mind would be particularly our Lake States National Forests are great. To me, they set the standard. And I'm saying other regions don't, but they set the standard in terms of being able to manage for timber and also more broadly ecologically. And you don't see the things that you would have seen 50 years ago in terms of patch cutting on the landscape. There's much more of a idea of maintaining connectivity, maintaining biological legacies across landscapes, and the way harvests are placed into the landscape, or silvicultural interventions. So, that's a place I guess I would look if you're truly thinking about bigger landscapes and how that's being done. That would be a place. Another place that comes to mind, Lake States would be Menominee Tribal Enterprises and their forestry program. You got a really big landscape there that's actively managed for wood, but done in a way that's ecological.
Great. So we did post the book link because there's been a lot of go read the book. So we've done that, and there are some other places where you can access that information as well. I'm going to pick two questions to close us out that are specific, I think, where you'll be able to draw on your work on the red pine adaptive silviculture for climate change site that you described. Let's see here. And of course, I lost my place. One is, you presented the resistance resilience transition framework and ecological forestry principles. Can you talk about how those concepts can help address the predicted or anticipated weather patterns of high intensity rain or wind events? So can you talk about kind of using some of these things you've talked about to anticipate disturbance?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I don't know how you would use that framework to anticipate future disturbances. And maybe the question is really, how does that kind of framework lead to what happens in future disturbances? And so, for example, I could be wrong, but and what the meaning is of the question, but there's nice research, and a paper just came out of somewhere in Europe, I can't remember, that talks about complex size and age structure forests as being more stable to severe wind disturbance. And there's a few places that have published on that, not us specifically. And so that would be an example if we expect greater, more frequent, more intense wind disturbances, that certain structures of forests that you would encourage with RRT might be more stable. Again, I'm not sure that's the intent of the question, but that's my answer. The other thing I'll say, Maria, I said it before, I'm going to say it again in case people didn't hear it. We do not get any royalties from our book. They're all donated to the Forest Stewardship Guild student fund. So if you're interested in helping those students that are interested in ecological forestry, it's done through the guild.
All right, and one last question. We will have a recording of this up on our page. I'll post that link again in a moment. So Brian, someone said that one of the pieces they get a little bit uncomfortable with, and perhaps others do too, is that the idea of the transition option means we're directing change to something along the lines of where we think it should be, and that incorporates, there's risk associated with that. You and I have had some recent conversations on this. How do you see the balance between letting forests adapt on their own versus directing change or pushing them to specific directions? And how does that relate to ecological forestry?
Yeah, that is an area of a lot of discussion, a lot of debate. Transition, depending on how you define that, can be high risk. In our case, we think it's pretty low risk in that, again, the species that we're looking at for northern Minnesota probably should be there already. But because of agricultural fields, parking lots, roads, no passenger pigeons, less blue jays, we don't have them there. But we know the climate is suitable, has been for 20 years. So we have 95% survival of white oak from, I'm trying to remember where we got it, Northern Illinois seed source. It should be there already. So it's pretty low risk when you think about adaptable species, generalist adaptable species like that, and moving them. The risk I see is doing what we're doing, being too short term, too short sighted. In fact, I've had Europeans come and visit our work, and their reaction is, "You're not thinking far enough down the road. You should be getting your seed sources from, Missouri or Kentucky instead of southern Minnesota or Wisconsin or Illinois." So that's a risk in my mind, that we're not doing enough because of the rapid changing climate that we're dealing with. These are great questions, Maria, really tough ones too. The kind of questions that I need follow up with whoever's asking.
Yeah, and we can definitely, I've been catching those questions while the chat. So I think you've answered plenty. So I'm going to turn it over to some of our fish and wildlife friends to close us out if there's any other housekeeping items.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for everything. That was a wonderful presentation. Well done. We're looking forward to having you in Maine for our forest ecology management course in September. And for those of you who might be interested in that, we will be holding it again in September next year. Who knows where? We'll plan that as we can. But if you are interested in that course, feel free to email me, and I can help you out with that as well. And maybe even Brian, if he is willing to field those emails. But yeah, great final presentation. Very excited to see what's up and coming. And I think having the webinar be a discussion sounds very cool. Jeff, do you want to speak more to that a wee bit?
No, I just really appreciate that folks have stayed interested to this series, and I hope we can continue to do it. And as long as we have speakers like Brian and hosts like Maria, then I'm sure people will continue to be interested. So thanks so much to everyone that has joined, and keep watching your email box. We have your email, so hopefully you'll hear from us. And now Brian, you have Brian's email, so his mailbox is going to be filled up. Great questions from folks. And again, thanks, Maria. Great job as a host too. You do that so well. So, Gwyneth, way to go. So,
thank you.
Nice to have the captioners too. That's a bonus.
And our ASL folks is too. You guys are great.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, great series. If you missed any, make sure to check out. I know that we have quite a few of them up on YouTube, and I think Maria posted links to those earlier in the chat. So be sure to check that out if you missed any. If you want credit for watching these webinars and also watching the ones on YouTube, make sure to email Jim Siegel. His email was in the opening slides as well, and I think is on the webinars announcement page. So without further ado, you guys, wonderful having you all, and hopefully we see you guys back up with our new webinar series. More to come.